Before we begin, if you love stories where a quiet, overlooked heart turns out to be the strongest thing in the room, each night she lay down in the maid's garret bone-weary from the day's labor and wearier still from the labor of pretending, and each morning she rose and put the plain gray mask back on before the others woke, and told herself that it could not be for much longer now, that the door at the end of the corridor could not stay shut against her forever. Stay with me to the very end. Because the woman in this story asked a servant for help, never once imagining that the plain man in the borrowed coat was the most powerful lord in the county, and that he had come in disguise for one reason only, to test the kindness of her heart. What she did not know was that he was about to discover a crime committed under his own roof, in his own name, against her. The morning the strangers came to Ashcombe Hollow, the mist had not yet lifted from the mill pond, and Rowan Verrill was already on her knees in the churchyard, scrubbing moss from a stone that bore no name. She did it every seventh day, though no one had asked her to, and no one thanked her for it. The stone belonged to a pauper the parish had buried without record, without mourner, without so much as a chiseled letter to say a life had passed. Rowan, who understood better than most what it meant to be erased, could not bear to see even a stranger forgotten. So she scrubbed, her breath clouded in the cold. Her fingers cracked at the knuckles from a winter of other people's washing, ached against the wet granite, and still she worked, patient and unhurried, until the moss came away and the bare stone showed clean. It would grow green again by the next month. She knew that. She would come back and do it again. That was the whole of it. The sexton had told her once, not unkindly, that she was wasting good soap on a man with no name and no family to thank her, and that the parish would not pay her a farthing for it. Rowan had only smiled and gone on with her brush. She had her own private reasons, though she gave them to no one. She knew what it was to have a name taken away. She knew what it was to be spoken of when she was spoken of at all, as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be met. And so the nameless stone had become, over her weeks in the village, a small and stubborn act of faith, a way of saying into the cold morning air that no one, however poor, however forgotten, ought to pass out of the world entirely unmarked. It was the one thing in her narrowed life that was purely her own, unwatched and unrewarded, and she guarded it the way another woman might have guarded a jewel. And behind her, unheard over the rasp of her brush and the drip of the yews, a man in a plain brown coat stood at the lich gate and watched her for a long, long while. He was not a man anyone in Ashcombe would have looked at twice. His boots were good but scuffed. His coat was the coat of a steward or an upper servant, decent cloth, no ornament, nothing to mark him out. He had the still, watchful bearing of a person accustomed to noticing things and to not being noticed himself, and just now the thing he was noticing was a slight young woman in a threadbare gray shawl, giving her only free morning of the week to a dead man who could never repay her, who would never even know. He did not know her name yet, but he would remember the sight of her there in the mist for the rest of his life. His name was Cassian Dray, and 3 days earlier he had been the Marquess of Ellenmere, the coldest, the richest, and by common account the most feared landholder in the county. He still was all of those things. The brown coat was a lie he wore deliberately, and he wore it well, because he had spent his whole life learning to hide what he truly was behind a still face and a quiet voice. But that comes in a moment. First, you must understand what Rowan did not. Rowan finished the stone, sat back on her heels, and pressed the heel of her hand to the ache in her spine. She was 23 and moved sometimes like a woman of 50, and she told herself it did not matter, because no one was watching. In this she was wrong. She gathered her brush and her rag and her little tin of soft soap, rose, and walked out through the lich gate, and there she nearly collided with him. "Forgive me," the man in the brown coat said, stepping back. His voice was low and even, the sort of voice that did not need to be raised to be obeyed, though just now he seemed to be trying to soften it. "I did not mean to startle you." "You didn't," Rowan said, which was not quite true, and they both knew it, and something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I am looking for the road to Ellenmere," he said. "I am told there is a great house that way. I have come about a position. You have come the long way round." Then she nodded past the church toward the grey rise of the moor. "The house is 3 miles on. Follow the beck until the trees thin, and you will see the chimneys before you see anything else. There are a great many chimneys." She hesitated, then added, "Because she could not help it. Mind the ford after the second bridge. It looks shallow. It is not. A carter came to grief there in the spring, and the water is higher now than it looks. You are kind to warn me. I am honest," she said. "It costs less than kindness and lasts longer." This time he did smile, and the smile changed his whole severe face, softening the hard line of it, and Rowan, who had learned long ago to distrust anything that came too easily, felt a small unwelcome warmth and turned quickly away from it. "Good day to you," she said, and walked on toward the village with her tin rattling in her basket, and did not look back. Which was a pity, because if she had, she might have seen the man in the brown coat still standing at the lich gate, watching her go, turning something over in his mind the way a man turns a coin he suspects is counterfeit, except that with her he was beginning to suspect the opposite. That the coin was real, that in his whole gilded life he had handled so few real things he had nearly forgotten what they weighed. He did not follow her. He went instead toward his own great house with its many chimneys, and he did not tell a single soul what he had seen. To understand why the richest man in 3 counties was standing in a country churchyard in a borrowed coat, you must go back 1 week to the library at Ellenmere, and to the death of the only person Cassian Dre had ever fully trusted, his grandmother. Old Lady Sabra Dre, the Dowager Marchioness, who had raised him after fever took his parents when he was a boy, had died in her sleep in the early spring, and she had left him more than a title and a fortune. She had left him a letter, sealed, to be opened only after she was in the ground. Cassian had carried it unopened in his breast for a full month because he was a man who governed feeling the way he governed his tenants, firmly and from a distance. When at last he broke the seal, alone at midnight, by a single candle in that great, silent library, he found his grandmother's spidery hand and these words, which he would come to know by heart. "You will be surrounded now by people who want something from you, and you will not be able to tell the honest from the false because wealth makes liars of nearly everyone who comes near it. I have watched it harden you, year by year, until I scarcely know the boy I raised. You measure people by their use to you, and you have stopped believing that kindness can exist without a price, because in your world it so rarely does. I fear you will marry some polished, grasping creature, and mistake her ambition for affection, and live behind your walls, and die as lonely as you have lived. So here is my last request, and if you ever loved me, you will honor it. Before you choose a wife, before you trust another living soul, go out from this house as a common man. Let no one know your name or your rank, and watch, only watch, how people treat a servant who can do nothing for them, who can offer them no advantage and no reward. The truth of a heart shows only when there is nothing to be gained by showing it. Find someone who is kind when kindness costs them and profits them nothing. Then, and only then, you will know." Cassian had read it 4 times through. Then, he had laughed. Shortly, and without any humor in it, because it was absurd. The fancy of a sentimental old woman who had read too many romances by her fire. He was 30 years old. He had an estate of 40,000 acres to run, tenants to answer for, a name centuries old to keep. He had no time for disguises and games. And yet, he would sit late in the great library of an evening, the only living soul in a house built for 100, and he would become aware in the silence of how very few voices in his life had ever wanted nothing of him. His solicitor wanted his business. His tenants wanted his leniency. The county families who dined at his table wanted his name upon their invitations and, for their daughters, upon a marriage settlement. Even the servants who bowed to him wanted only to keep their places and their wages, which was fair enough and no fault of theirs. And yet it meant that in 30 years he had never once been able to tell whether a single warm word spoken to him was true coin or false. His grandmother had been the one exception, the one person whose love had asked him for nothing, and now she was in the ground, and the silence she had left behind her was so complete that some nights he could hear the clocks in 3 rooms at once. And yet the letter would not let him alone. It sat in his breast for 3 more days, growing heavier, until one gray morning he found he could not carry it any longer without answering it. So he told his household he was traveling north on business, and would send word, and he put on the plainest coat in the servants' press, and he rode out alone toward the villages, at the ragged edge of his own land, where no one had ever seen the Marquess's face up close, and where he could be for a little while. He had not expected to find anything. In truth, he had expected to prove his grandmother wrong, to ride home in a week satisfied that the world was exactly as cold as he had always believed it, and to bury her letter in a drawer with a clear conscience. He had not expected a girl scrubbing a nameless grave in the mist because she could not bear to let a stranger stay forgotten. "What is your test, then, grandmother?" he thought, riding slowly back toward his own chimneys with the churchyard still behind him. "You wished me to find a heart that is kind when kindness costs it and earns it nothing. I have been in the world 1 week, and already I have found one, and she does not know me, and she never will unless I choose it." The thought should have satisfied him. Instead, it unsettled him to the bone. For a test is a simple thing when you are certain no one will pass it. It becomes a very dangerous thing indeed the moment someone does. He resolved, that first evening, to learn everything he could about her. He did not yet understand that in learning about Rowan Varel, he would uncover a wrong done under his own name, on his own land, by a man he paid and trusted, and that the quiet girl in the churchyard had come to Ashcombe Hollow, carrying a secret every bit as heavy as his own. Rowan's secret was this: she had not always washed other people's linen. 2 winters past she had been Rowan Varel of Millbrook, the only child of a respected land surveyor, a careful and gentle man who had taught her to read a map and keep a ledger and write a fair clerk's hand, skills unusual in a woman, and, as it turned out, dangerous ones to possess without a protector. When her father took a chill fording a swollen river in another man's service and died of it within the fortnight, he had left her a small stone cottage, a strip of good bottom land by the water, and the promise of a sum owed to him by the great estate he had surveyed in his last year wages, and a settlement together, set down plainly in writing. Done enough to keep her modestly for years. She had seen none of it, not a penny. The steward who held her father's contract, a smooth and sorrowful man named Mr. Hal von Pryke, had come to her with grave regret and a sheaf of papers. The papers showed the debt already paid in full, and the cottage forfeit against a loan she had never once known her father to take. The signatures upon them were her father's. Rowan knew her father's hand better than she knew her own, every loop and stroke of it, and she knew, in the very instant she saw them, that they were forged, and forged by a skilled and patient hand. But a surveyor's orphan daughter has no standing in law against a gentleman's steward, and when she said the word forgery aloud, Pryke had looked at her with such tender pity that she almost doubted her own eyes. "Grief," he told her softly, "makes people imagine a great many things." She would do well, he said, not to repeat such a slander, for slander was a crime, and she had no one left in the world to protect her from the consequences of it. And so she had lost the cottage and the good bottom land and her name among the people who had known her since childhood, and at the last her home itself. She had drifted from parish to parish, taking in laundry and scrubbing other people's floors, and she had told no one who she truly was, because a fallen gentlewoman is an object of suspicion and pity and unkind talk, while a plain servant is merely invisible. And invisible, she had learned, was far safer. But she had not come to Ashcombe Hollow by chance. An old friend of her father's, a retired parish clerk with a failing memory and a stubborn conscience, had written to her not long before his own death with one last thing he believed she ought to know before he took it to his grave. The settlement her father had been owed, the money that had simply vanished had, in fact, been paid. He was almost certain of it. Paid in full and paid on time by the great estate her father had surveyed in his final autumn. Paid, of course, into the hands of the steward who held the contract. The wrong was not that the debt had gone unpaid. The wrong was far darker than that. The debt had been paid and then stolen, and the theft dressed up cleverly as a forfeiture, so that the daughter would blame her dead father and never think to look higher. And the great estate that had paid the money, the estate whose vast northern acres her father had spent his last healthy autumn walking and mapping in the wind, was Ellenmere. That was why Rowan Verrill had taken a laundress's place in a village 3 miles from the great house with too many chimneys. Somewhere within Ellenmere's estate office there would be records, the payment ledger, a receipt of monies sent, the countersigned contract, and those records would prove two things at once: that the money had truly been sent, and by its absence from every honest account it should have reached, that Halvin Pryke had taken it for himself. Proof was all she had ever truly wanted. Not the money, though heaven knew she needed it badly. Proof that her father had not been a secret debtor and a liar. Proof enough to let her stand in the daylight and speak her own true name again without shame. She had been in Ashcombe 6 weeks, washing sheets and biding her time, waiting for a way into a house that did not admit laundresses 1 step past the scullery door. She had no way in the world of knowing that the way in had just asked her for directions at the lich gate and smiled at her and called her kind. Nor could she have begun to guess the cruelest thread of all, the one that would draw tight around them both before the season turned. The smooth, sorrowful steward who had ruined her, Halvin Pryke, no longer served the estate under which he had robbed her father. He had risen in the world since that grey day. He had found himself a grander position, with a grander master, in a house with a very great many chimneys. He was, at that very moment, sitting in the estate office at Ellenmere, balancing the Marquis's accounts in his careful, sorrowful hand. Ellenmere was not a house so much as a hell breath. Rowan felt it the very moment she passed beneath the great gate arch, with the other village women hired on for the season's cleaning. That peculiar hush that settles over a place whose master is always expected and never comes. The many chimneys she had promised the stranger at the lich gate stood cold and grey against a pewter sky, and of them all, only 3 sent up any smoke. The housekeeper met the new women in the flagged passage below stairs, and Rowan knew her at once for exactly what she was, before ever a word was spoken. Mrs. Almira Dunmore was a tall, spare woman with iron-colored hair scraped back so tightly it seemed to pull thought itself into order, and a heavy ring of keys at her waist that she touched, now and then, the way an old soldier touches the hilt of a sword. She walked slowly down the line of new women, her eyes traveling over aprons and hands and hems, and she did not see people at all. She saw only work, and the ever-present possibility of work done badly. "You will speak when you are spoken to," she said, "to all of them and to none of them. You will not go above the green baize door. You will not enter the family rooms, nor the muniment room, nor the master's study, on any errand whatsoever. You will not touch what you have not been told to touch." Her cold gaze passed over Rowan and did not pause. The last girl who forgot herself now begs her bread in Kettleford. You would do well to remember her. Rowan lowered her eyes and said nothing at all, which was the correct answer, and felt the old familiar smallness settle over her like a second apron worn beneath the first. She had learned long ago how to be furniture, how to still her face and quiet her step and become part of a room. It was a skill, and an unlovely one, and it had kept her fed through 2 hard winters. She had learned, too, the geography of below-stairs loyalty, which was every bit as intricate as the geography of the house itself, and a good deal more dangerous to misread. She learned which of the maids carried tales to Mrs. Dunmore, and which merely feared her. She learned that the cook was kind but timid, that the head footman was vain and might be managed with a little flattery, that the hungry scullery boy would do almost anything for a soul who was gentle with him. She filed each small fact away without ever seeming to, the way her father had once taught her to note the lie of a field and the fall of water across it. For a person who means to move unseen through a great house must first learn exactly where all its eyes are set and whose they answer to. But her mind was not small, and her mind was not still. Her mind was mapping the house. As Mrs. Dunmore led them through the warren of the ground floor, the still room, the scullery, the long cold larder that smelled of stone and old meat, Rowan counted the doors and marked in her memory the ones that were locked. And there was one at the far end of a paneled corridor she was not meant to notice, that was not merely locked, but guarded by its very locking. A heavy oak door with a new brass plate and a fresh iron hasp, the old wood around the fittings scarred bright where the ironmonger had lately been at work, the estate office, the room where a great house keeps its debts and its promises and its receipts, the one room in all of England she had crossed 3 parishes to reach. She let herself look at it for the space of a single heartbeat, and then she looked away because she felt eyes upon her, not the housekeeper's. Across the passage, in the shadow of the pantry arch, stood the plain man from the churchyard, the one who had asked her the road to Ellenmere and called her honest, and made her feel, for one strange moment, like a person rather than a pair of working hands. He was here. He wore the same brown coat, and one of the liveried footmen had just bent to say something in his ear, with the particular deference that servants show only to a superior, and Rowan understood, with a small cold lurch beneath her ribs, that he had come about a position after all and got one, and that they would be living now under the same great roof. She did not know whether to be glad of it or afraid of it. In her experience, the two feelings were seldom far apart. He inclined his head to her, the smallest possible movement, barely a greeting at all, and Rowan looked quickly down at the flagstones and pretended she had not seen. She did not know that he had spoken 3 quiet words to Mrs. Dunmore that very morning. The laundress is reliable. She did not know that her being here, at all inside the walls 3 doors down from the one room she needed, was not luck or providence, but a gift laid quietly at her feet by a man who did not yet have the faintest idea what she was searching for, only that he wished, very much, to see more of the girl who scrubbed the graves of strangers in the mist. Mrs. Dunmore stopped them at last before a great mountain of household linen gone gray and sour with damp. "You," she said, and it took Rowan a full moment to understand that the housekeeper meant her. "You have a laundress's hands. You will take the master's linens and the office linens both. Mr. Pryke is particular in the extreme. You will wash, you will return, you will not linger, and you will not, under any circumstance that heaven or earth may send, disturb his papers." She held out a folded stack of linen, and upon the very top of it lay a fine napkin embroidered with a monogram. Rowan did not yet know that she had cause to fear. "Mr. Pryke keeps the accounts of this whole house," she said, "and Mr. Pryke does not forgive carelessness in anyone." The name landed in the cold passage like a stone dropped into a still well, and Rowan's whole body went still with it. Pryke. It was not a common name. She had heard it spoken by only one man in the whole of her life, a smooth and sorrowful man, who had shown her forged signatures by candlelight and told her so gently that grief made people imagine things. Surely, she told herself, there was more than one Pryke in all of England. Surely there must be. But she took the linens from the housekeeper's hands, and her own hands had begun, very slightly, to shake. She saw him the next morning. Rowan had carried the clean office linens down the paneled corridor, telling herself the whole length of it that it would prove to be a stranger, some stout and ordinary pryke, a mere coincidence of a shared name and nothing more. The guarded door stood open the width of a hand, and lamplight fell out of it in a long yellow bar across the dark floor, and a voice within was speaking, low and unhurried and faintly regretful, the voice of a man who has never once in his life had to raise it, because the world has always sorrowfully arranged itself just as he wished. Rowan knew that voice the way she would have known her own father's in a crowd of 1,000. She stopped dead in the corridor and could not make her feet carry her forward. Through the narrow gap, she could see him at the great desk. Halvin Pryke, grayer at the temple than 2 winters past, dressed a good deal better than any steward had a right to dress, his careful hands moving over the Marquess's ledgers exactly as they had once moved over her father's contract in the days before he made it lie. The man who had stolen her name and her home and her father's good memory had risen in the world, and the world had rewarded him with the keys to a far greater house, and by some black jest of fate, with the keys to the very door behind which her only proof most likely lay. He looked up. For one horrible moment his sorrowful eyes rested full upon her face, and Rowan felt 2 whole years of carefully built invisibility peel away from her like wet paper from a wall. She had been a lady the last time he saw her, better fed, better dressed, her dark hair her own, and dressed by her own hand. She was thinner now, and roughened, and aproned, and her hair was hidden beneath a plain linen cap. She prayed with everything in her that it was enough. She dropped into a low servant's bob, fixed her eyes hard upon the floor, set the linens down upon the side table, and did not so much as breathe. "You are the new laundress," Pryke said. It was not a question. His gaze lingered upon her a beat too long, and across his smooth brow there passed a small pucker, a flicker of half-memory reaching for a thing it could not quite grasp. There and then gone again. "Have we met, girl?" "Somewhere before?" "No, sir." Her voice came out low and steady, and she thanked God on her knees in her heart for it. "I have come from Kettleford way, sir. Only these 6 weeks past." He studied her a moment longer, the way a careful man studies a column of figures that has not quite come right. Then he lost all interest in her, the way powerful men lose interest in furniture, and turned back to his ledgers. "Set him there," he said, "and close the door as you go out. This room is not for the likes of you." She fled. She did not run. She had trained herself out of running years before, but she walked back up the corridor with her heart slamming against her ribs and her thoughts in a white and roaring disorder, and she did not stop until she had reached the little cold court behind the pump, where no one ever went, and there she gripped the cold stone edge of the trough with both hands and shook. He was here, the very man who had unmade her, holding the door to the one thing in the world that might remake her. If he ever placed her face, if that flicker behind his sorrowful eyes ever caught and held, he had only to murmur the word thief or the word slanderer to Mrs. Dunmore, and Rowan would be turned out onto the open moor before nightfall, or worse, handed over to a magistrate on whatever charge a clever and sorrowful man might trouble himself to invent. She had walked into the trap on her own 2 feet, and pulled the door shut behind her. And it was in that moment, with her knuckles white on the stone, that a shadow fell across the wet cobbles, and a low, even voice she already knew said, "You look as though you have seen a ghost." She turned. The man in the brown coat stood at the mouth of the little court, a wooden bucket in each hand, as though he had merely come for water, though there was a stillness about him even so that had nothing of the servant in it. Cassian, the one kind face in all this cold and watchful house. She should have said, "It is nothing, sir." It was what furniture said. It was what she had said 100 times before. But she was frightened past bearing, and he had called her honest, and something in his quiet steadiness slipped past 2 years of hard-learned caution before she could stop it. Before she had weighed a single word, the words were already out of her. "I need," she began, and stopped, and started again, lower still. If ever I had to leave this place quickly, quietly, in the night, without notice given. Could you help me? You know the household, now the back ways, the doors, the roads. Out she lifted her chin, hating with her whole soul that she had to ask it, and asking it all the same. I have no one else in this house to ask. Will you help me? And Castian Dre, Marquis of Ellenmere, master of every stone and every soul beneath that vast roof, who could have dismissed Halvin Pryke with one sentence spoken over his shoulder, who could have made her a lady again before the supper bell rang, looked into the frightened face of the girl who had not the slightest notion that she was speaking to the most powerful man for 30 miles in any direction, and felt his grandmother's letter turn over in his breast like a live coal against his heart. "Yes," he said quietly, "I will help you." He had no notion yet on this earth what he had just promised, nor to whom. Neither had she. And in the office behind them, Halvin Pryke sat frowning down at a sum that would not come right, and thinking, with the slow patience of a spider in its web, that he had, somewhere, once, a long time ago, known a girl who held her chin at exactly that angle. The old woman in the East Tower knew him at once. Of course, she had known him since he was 6 years old, and afraid of the dark, and there are some things that neither age nor blindness can take from a heart. Rowan was sent up to her rooms 2 days after, the one part of the whole house above the baize door that she was permitted to enter, because the occupant of those rooms required a woman's hands about her and had long outlived every other servant who remembered her name. Miss Elowen Marsh had been companion and confidant to the late dowager for 50 years and more, and now that her old mistress was in the ground, she lived on alone in 3-paneled rooms at the very top of the East Tower, half-blind, entirely undeceived by anyone, waited upon grudgingly by a household that did not quite dare to turn out a dead great lady's oldest and dearest friend. She sat by a fire, kept far too high for the season, wrapped in soft shawls of a quality no laundress would ever touch in her life, and when Rowan came in quietly with the coal scuttle, she turned her clouded eyes toward the sound and said, "Come here to me, child, and let me look at you with my hands, for my eyes have long since given up the work." Rowan set down the scuttle and knelt. Papery, feather-light fingers found her face and traced her jaw, and then, lightly and quite deliberately, found her hands and turned them over, pressing at the callus and the cracked knuckle and the old pale burn scars that lie soap leaves behind. "These are new," Elowen said, very softly. These hands did not always do this kind of work. Beneath the laborer's skin, the shape of them is quite different. These are a clerk's hands, a reader's hands. Now, whose daughter are you, really? Rowan's breath stopped in her throat. "I am a laundress, ma'am," she said. "From Kettleford." "And I am a great beauty of 19 summers." The old woman smiled, and it was a warm and kindly smile. And kindness, Rowan had learned the hardest way there was, is the most difficult thing in all the world to stand against. Keep your secret then, child. I have kept a great many in my time, and one more will not trouble me. But hear an old woman out a moment, for I am dying, and the dying are permitted to be tiresome. She settled back into her shawls. My mistress, God rest her soul, believed a thing that the whole clever world was pleased to laugh at. She believed you cannot ever truly know a soul by what it does when it is watched, or paid, or rewarded, or afraid. You can only know a soul by what it chooses to do, when there is nothing whatever to be gained by the doing, when no one is watching, and no coin will come of it, and no one will ever so much as know. That, she used to say, is where the true grain of a person shows itself at last, the way the grain of good wood shows only under the plane. Her clouded eyes drifted toward the tower window, toward a churchyard 3 miles distant that she would never see again. She used to say, the whole tragedy of the very rich is that they are never once loved for nothing in the whole of their lives. Every kindness ever shown to them is an investment made in hope of return, And so they die at the last, never having been given a single freely given thing. The old woman's voice thinned to a thread. It broke her heart, that thought, and most of all, it broke her heart for her grandson. She feared he would live his whole life so, and die so, and go into the dark never once having known the difference between a warm hand held out to him and a grasping one. Rowan sat very still on the warm hearthstone. Her grandson, she said, choosing each word with great care. You mean the master, the Marquess himself, the Marquess himself. Aloan Marsh turned her blind face full upon Rowan, and though the eyes were milky and clouded, there was something living behind them that saw perfectly well. Yes, Cassian. A cold and wary and deeply wounded creature, my dear, and small wonder, for he was raised on very little else but ambition dressed up in the clothes of love. She paused, and a strange, dry humor crept into her voice. I am told, all through the house, that he has not yet come home to take up his inheritance. That the whole staff awaits his lordship's arrival any day now. A small, extraordinary, knowing smile touched her withered mouth. How very strange, then, is it not, that I heard his own particular step upon my stair this very morning, a step I would know among 10,000 others in the dark, bringing his half-blind old Aloan her coal in a plain brown coat, and saying not one word, and thinking, the dear foolish boy, that I would never know him. The coal scuttle slipped in Rowan's suddenly nerveless hands and rang against the iron fender. You are mistaken, ma'am, she began. I am mistaken in nothing, child, save the color of a curtain now and again. The old woman reached out with startling swiftness and caught Rowan's wrist in a grip of surprising strength. I tell you this because you have a good heart, and because you have made yourself a great many enemies in this house without meaning to, and because you do not yet know which of the faces around you are the friendly ones and which are not. So you will learn it from me, and you will learn it quickly. The man you take for a fellow servant is nothing of the kind, and the smooth steward you take for merely stern and safe is very far from safe. And whatever it is you have truly come into this house to find, and do not trouble to deny that there is something. Her grip tightened hard about the wrist. You had best find it and be gone before those two men ever discover the truth of each other. Because on the day they do, girl, this house will not merely wake from its long sleep, it will catch fire. Rowan went back down the winding tower stair with her empty scuttle and her heart pounding, and she did not remember a single step of the descent. The old woman's words followed her the whole way down. The man you take for a fellow servant is nothing of the kind. If it were true, and something in the certainty of that blind and knowing voice told her that it was, then the plain man in the brown coat who had promised so gently to help her flee was the Marquess himself, the master of the very house she meant to rob of its secrets, the paymaster of the very steward who had destroyed her. She had asked her enemy's master for help. She had looked into his face and felt safe. The thought made her almost laugh aloud. There on the cold stair, a laugh that was half a sob, for it was either very funny or very terrible, and she could not for the life of her decide which. The first crack in Cassian Dre did not come from any great blow. It came, as it always does with a guarded man, from something small, a mere hairline in the stone, that he did not even notice at first, until the whole of it gave way at once. He had meant only to observe her. That was the cold discipline of the thing, his grandmother's test, conducted at arm's length, a man weighing a soul the way he might weigh a coin in his palm. He would watch the laundress a while longer, confirm at last his old suspicion that even her kindness had some floor beneath it past which it would not go, some price at which it would falter, and then he would be satisfied and done. Instead, he found himself, over the following days, quietly, and without ever quite admitting it, arranging to be wherever she was. He carried coal. He had no need to carry. He lingered by the pump on errands he invented as he went. And in the lingering, he learned things. He learned that she gave away half of her own small dinner, day after day to the scullery boy who was always hungry and always growing, and that she did it when she believed no living soul could see. He learned that she had mended the old gardener's split coat without being asked and without a word said, because the man's hands shook too badly with the palsy to hold a needle himself. He learned that when the other women in the wash-house mocked a simple stable lad for the bad stammer that seized his tongue, it was Rowan who spoke to the boy slowly and gently, until the stammer loosed its grip, and then asked him about the horses in his care, as though his halting answer were the most interesting thing said in the whole county that year. And none of it, not one single act of it, was performed for any watcher. That was the thing that undid him utterly. He had spent the whole 30 years of his life among people who were forever performing, for his favor, for his money, for the reflected warmth of his ancient name, and here, 3 doors from his own study, was a girl who did quiet good in the dark corners where it could earn her precisely nothing, for the plain and simple reason that she did not know any other way to be. Find someone who is kind when kindness costs them and profits them nothing. He had thought it, when he read it, an impossible standard, a dead woman's fancy. He was watching her meet it a dozen times a day, without effort, without even knowing she did it. He told himself for a while that it was still only observation. And then, upon one gray and heavy afternoon, he came upon her alone in the cold court behind the pump, and she was not being kind to anyone at all. She was only standing with her thin back against the wall, and her tired face turned up to the pale and grudging light, and she looked so weary, so worn, thin by whatever unseen weight it was that she carried, that the sudden fierce ache he felt beneath his own ribs had nothing of the cold scientist left in it, and everything of the living man. He wanted with a violence that frightened him where he stood, to mend whatever was broken in her world, to lift the weight clean off her narrow shoulders, to set her somewhere safe. And a marquis could set a laundress safe with a single word. That was the whole obscene and effortless ease of his power, and yet he understood in the same breath that the very instant he spoke that word, the true girl in the gray light would vanish forever, and in her place would stand someone grateful and careful and watchful and performing, exactly like every other person he had ever known in his gilded life. He turned and left the court without a sound, and she never knew he had been there. But he was no longer conducting any test, and he knew it, and the knowing of it terrified him, and he told not one living soul. He began, in those days, to sleep badly. He would lie awake in the great cold state bedchamber that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him, and he would turn the problem over and over in the dark like a stone in the hand. He could not go on as he was. To keep the brown coat forever was impossible, a boy's game that could only end in some greater deception. To cast it off and reveal himself was to lose the one true thing he had found, the girl in the gray light who spoke to him as an equal because she believed him one. And beneath both of these lay the newer trouble, the smooth steward, and the accounts that would not be shown, which had nothing to do with any laundress and everything to do with the honor of his own house. He did not yet know that the 3 troubles were, in truth, a single one, and that it was even now walking toward him down a dark corridor with a candle in its hand. That same evening, he did a thing he had not done in all the time he had worn the brown coat. He went, as himself, as the master, in his own fine dark clothes and unannounced, down to the estate office, and he stood filling the doorway and watched Halvin Pryke rise in startled haste, and he asked, in the cold, flat voice that the whole county had learned to fear, to be shown the full accounts of his late grandfather's northern survey of some years past. Pryke, all sorrow and smoothness even in his surprise, replied that the older ledgers were sadly in some disorder, that they would want a few days setting to rights before they were fit for his lordship's eyes. Cassian said nothing to that at all, but he had seen the steward's careful hands go, for the space of a single instant, quite perfectly still upon the desk, the particular stillness of a man who has just been asked, without warning, for the one thing on earth he cannot afford to show. And a small, cold suspicion, joined as yet to no laundress and no churchyard, drew its first breath in the Marquess's mind. Two secrets were moving now through one silent house, along converging paths, toward the very same locked door. And the one man, who could have simply opened that door with the key at his own belt, did not yet understand that he must. Rowan chose the night of the storm. She had marked it out and waited for it the better part of a week. The household was thinned to almost nothing. Half the staff gone off to a servant's fair in the next parish. Mrs. Dunmore departed to sit with an ailing sister 2 villages distant. And best of all, that very afternoon, she had watched with her own eyes as Halvan Pryke was called away, summoned north to Kettleford on a matter of the estate's leases, told plainly by the understeward that he would not be looked for again before the morrow's noon. The office would stand empty through the whole long night. The office would be hers. And it might well be the only such night she would ever get before that slow flicker behind Pryke's eyes finally caught and blazed, and she was not fool enough to let it pass her by. She waited until the great house had sunk down at last into its held and troubled breath, until the final rushlight had been pinched out, and the only sound left in all the world was the rain flung against the black windows in great cold fistfuls. Then she rose, fully dressed beneath her blanket, took up the stub of candle she had hoarded away for a fortnight, and went down through the dark by the back stairs, feeling her way stair by stair with one hand upon the cold wall, her heart a hammer beating hard against her ribs. Twice she froze upon the stairs, certain she had heard a step behind her, and twice it was only the old house shifting and complaining in the wind the way old houses do. The great hall, when she reached it, was a vast cavern of moving shadow, the tall windows flickering white with distant lightning, the long-dead faces of Dray ancestors watching her without expression from their frames upon the walls. She kept to the darkest edge of the room and moved along it with her back near to the paneling, one silent step and then another, until the mouth of the paneled corridor opened before her and the guarded door stood waiting at the end of it. She had rehearsed this walk 100 times in her mind, lying awake in the dark of the maid's garret. It was entirely different in the doing. In the doing, her mouth was dry as ash, and her hands would not quite stop their trembling. The office door was locked. She had known that it would be. But her father had been a surveyor all his life, and a surveyor's daughter knows well that a fine new brass lock set into old oak is very often far stronger than the small iron screws that hold its hasp to the softened wood. And the hasp, when she worked at it patiently in the dark with the thin flat blade of her scaling knife, and with all the hard patience that 2 ruined years had beaten into her, gave way at the last, with a small sharp shriek of tearing wood that the storm outside swallowed whole. The heavy door swung inward. The close smell of ink and leather and cold dead ash rolled out to meet her. She slipped inside and pressed the door softly to behind her, and stood a moment in the dark with her own blood roaring in her ears. Her small candle showed her the great desk and the banked and shadowed shelves of ledgers rising to the ceiling, and the deed boxes ranked along the far wall like a row of little black coffins. Somewhere in this room, a payment set down, a receipt countersigned, a sum sent north to settle an honest surveyor's fee. Somewhere in this room, her father's honest name waiting 2 years to be found. She began to search. She worked her way along the boxes, reading the faded years upon their spines by the guttering flame, her fingers leaving clean, bright tracks through the fine gray dust. Her hands shook, and she steadied them by main force of will. She found the year at last, the very autumn her father had walked and mapped Ellenmere's northern acres in the wind, and she drew the heavy box down and knelt with it upon the cold bare boards and lifted the lid, and the papers folded within were the very thing she had crossed 3 parishes on foot to find. The estate's own faithful record of all moneys paid out that quarter, entry upon entry in Pryke's own careful hand, and there, near the foot of the second page, there it was, at last, at last. A single floorboard groaned aloud in the passage beyond the door. Rowan's candle was out between her wet fingers before she had even decided to move, and the absolute dark came down over the room like a lid. She pressed herself back into the deep well beneath the great desk, the precious papers clutched hard against her chest, and did not breathe. The rain hammered on. And beneath the sound of the rain, unmistakable, came the slow easing open of the office door, and then a tread crossing the boards toward the desk beneath which she crouched, an unhurried tread, deliberate and quiet. She had gambled that Pryke was gone to Kettleford, and gambling was the one luxury the poor could never truly afford. The trap she had walked into on her own 2 feet had shut fast behind her, and here she was inside it in the pitch dark, with the very proof of the thief's crime pressed hard against her heart, and no way at all past him to reach the door. The footsteps stopped. Close by, a tinderbox rasped once and again, and light bloomed golden in the room above her hiding place. And then a voice spoke quietly into the dark and the light, and it was not the sorrowful voice she had braced her whole soul against. It was a low and even voice that she knew from a churchyard in the morning mist. "Whoever you are," the voice said, "you have exactly 1 chance to explain yourself to me before I raise the house. Were I in your place, I would be quick to take it." It was not Pryke at all. It was Cassian. And Rowan, crouched trembling in the dark, with the thief's stolen evidence gathered in her arms, and no safe name she dared to give, understood, in a rush of despair, that the one man in all this house who had promised faithfully to help her was the very same man now standing between her and her ruin, and that to explain herself at all, she must first confess aloud that she had broken by night into her master's private office, a thing no servant in England ever survives the confessing of. She had a single heartbeat in which to choose, and she chose, as she had always in the end chosen, the truth. It was, when all was said, the whole reason she was poor. She came out from beneath the desk and rose slowly into the golden lamplight, the papers held up before her like a shield against a coming blow, and she lifted her chin, and she met his astonished eyes with her own, and she said, "My name is not the name I gave you. And these papers here, in my hands, will prove to you that a man in this house is a thief. Raise the house if you must, but read them first." I have finished being quiet. Cassian did not raise the house. He stood there with the lamp burning in his hand, and looked at the girl he had first come upon scrubbing a stranger's grave in the mist, standing now in a broken open office with stolen ledgers clutched against her breast and her chin held high, and her whole slight body braced hard against the blow she was so certain must be coming. And he did a thing he had not once done in the whole long, disciplined length of his careful life. He set the lamp down gently upon the desk, and he crossed the floor to her, and he held out his hand, not to seize the papers from her, but open and palm upward, an offering rather than a demand. "Show me," he said, and she did. There, upon the great desk, in the steady pool of lamplight, with the storm still flinging itself in fury at the black glass of the windows, Rowan Verrill spread out her hard-won proof and told him her whole story from its beginning, all of it. The surveyor father in his careful hand, the forged signatures by candlelight, the smooth and sorrowful steward in his tender, ruinous pity, the stone cottage in the good bottomland, by the water, and the true name she had not dared to speak aloud in 2 long years. She showed him the estate's own faithful record of a fee sent north in full, and she told him what her father's old friend had sworn to her upon his very deathbed, that the money had been sent, and had been received into a steward's hands, and had never once reached the honest man to whom it was owed. And Cassian, reading down the columns of Pryke's careful hand by the light of his own lamp, saw with his own eyes the entries turned smooth and false at the precise place where his own cold suspicion, born only that same afternoon, had told him that a guilty man's hands had gone still. He understood then, all at once and completely, 3 separate things. He understood that the grievous wrong done to this girl had been done under his own family's ancient name, upon his own land, and lay even now unremedied and festering within his own accounts. He understood that the steward he had trusted with the very keys to his house was a thief who had ruined an honest man's only daughter, and who would, the very instant he placed her face at last, move without mercy to destroy her utterly in order to protect himself. And he understood, with a shame that rose in him like cold water, that he had held it within his own power, that he had always held it within his power, every single day that he had stood by that pump in a borrowed brown coat weighing the worth of her soul, to set the whole of this right with a word, and had not done it, because he had been so occupied in the administering of his grandmother's clever test, that he had never once noticed the person truly being tested was himself, and that he had come within a hair of failing it altogether. "Rowan," he said. He spoke her true name, and the sound of it stopped her breath. Mid-word, Rowan Verrill. "Look at me." She looked. And he watched the exact moment that the whole world tilted and slid beneath her feet, the moment she understood, from the way that he had said her name, from the sudden and absolute authority that had come into the voice of a fellow servant, that the man standing before her in his shirt sleeves was no fellow servant at all. "I must tell you a thing now," he said low and steady, "and you will hate me for it, and you will be entirely right to hate me. My name is not the name I gave you either." He drew in a breath that plainly cost him a great deal. "I am Cassian Dre. I am the Marquis of Ellenmere. This is my house, that is my steward. And you came to me in the cold court, frightened half to death, with no one else in all the world to turn to, and you asked a servant to help you flee into the night, and I said yes to you. And then I let you go on believing that I was that servant, because I was a coward. And because for the first time in the whole of my life, another human soul had asked me for help without knowing there was the smallest thing to be gained by the asking. I could not bring myself to give that up. I am sorry. It was the one honest and freely given thing I have ever been handed in my life, and I hoarded it away like a miser, and in that I am no better than the man whose name is in these ledgers." The silence stretched out long between them. The storm outside began at last to ease. Somewhere, far below in the sleeping house, a clock told the small hour softly into the dark. Rowan Verrill stood very straight, and her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears and not quite fury, but partook of both, and when at last she spoke, her voice did not shake at all. "You watched me," she said. "You watched me give away my dinner and mend an old man's coat, and you stood there in your borrowed coat, and you measured me." "Yes," he said, "I did, to see whether I would be kind when it cost me and won me nothing. Because your grandmother had it fixed in her head that no one ever is." He went pale to the lips. "You cannot possibly know that." "I do not," she said, "but your Miss Marsh does. She sees a great deal more from behind your blind eyes than you do from behind your two good ones." She drew a slow breath. "So, I have passed your test, my lord. I hope that you are satisfied." "No," said Cassian, and it broke out of him raw and stripped of every cold and careful thing that he had built his whole life from. "No, I am not satisfied, because you were never once the one being tested here, Rowan. It was I. And I have only in this last hour understood the true shape of the question. My grandmother did not send me out from this house to go and find a kind heart in the world. She sent me out to learn whether I still had one left in my own breast to recognize it with." He laid his open hand flat upon the false and guilty ledgers, upon the desk between them. "You are owed a very great deal by this house," he said. "Your name, your father's honor, your home, and every last coin that man stole away in mine, and you shall have all of it, every part, not as charity, for you would throw charity back into my face and you would be right to do it. You shall have it as justice, and it shall be given back into your hands in the plain sight of the very man who took it from you, so that no living soul in this county may ever again make you drop your eyes to the floor." Rowan looked long at the powerful and wounded and wary man who had both lied to her and helped her in the same breath, who had walked into a country churchyard in a borrowed coat in search of a kind heart, and found to his own great cost that the heart most in need of finding was his own, and she felt, rising slowly beneath the anger and beneath the shock of it all, the first frail and unfamiliar warmth of a thing she had long ago stopped allowing herself to believe could be real. Then we had far better put every one of these papers back exactly as they were, she said quietly, and let Mr. Pryke keep his sorrowful face upon him one more day, because a man of that particular kind, my lord, does not fall from a single shout across a room. He falls, and he falls hard, from being handed enough rope to hang himself with in the broad and open daylight. And I have waited 2 full years for it. I believe that I can wait 1 week more to see the thing done properly. And slowly, there in the lamplight, with the storm dying away beyond the glass, the Marquis of Ellenmere began, for the first time in a very long time, to smile, but the smile did not last long, and when it faded, something graver took its place. For he understood now that the week ahead would ask more of him than the mere unmasking of a thief. It would ask him to undo, publicly and at some cost to his own pride, the comfortable belief of a lifetime that his house was well run, his people well chosen, his judgment sound. He had trusted Pryke. He had signed, unread, the very accounts in which the theft lay hidden, in a sense that no court would ever name, but that he could not now unfeel the wrong done to Rowan Verrill had been done with his own careless hand upon the pen. Justice, he was beginning to see, was not something a great man dispensed from above, clean and untouched. It was something he owed and paid, and was diminished by the owing. His grandmother had known that. She had tried for years to make him see it. It had taken a laundress with a scaling knife to finish the lesson. Let us pause here just a moment. If this story is holding you, do let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and if you would like to hear how it ends, take a moment now to subscribe so the tale can find its way back to you. And now, to the reckoning. Pryke came for her first. Of course he did. His kind always does. The slow flicker behind his sorrowful eyes had caught and held at last some trick of the set of Rowan's chin. Some old buried memory shaken suddenly loose in the night, and 3 days after the storm he went to Mrs. Noter, Dunmore with all his grave and gentle certainty, and named the laundress a thief and a fraud to her face, a fallen woman traveling the country under a false name, a danger to the good order of the whole house, to be turned out of doors at once and without a character before ever she could rob it. He did it cleverly, and with sorrow, and with every appearance of reluctant regret, in exactly the manner he had once used to ruin her father, the quiet and weighted word of a powerful man, set against a servant girl who had no way on earth to answer it. What he did not know, what no one below stairs yet knew, was that the master of the house was no longer away, that the Marquess had made himself known. For in the 3 days between the storm and the reckoning, Cassian had done a careful and deliberate thing. He had let it be known through the proper channels, the butler, the steward's own underclerk, that his lordship had returned from the north and would take up residence, and that he wished the household assembled to receive him. He had not said why. He had let Pryke walk into the hall believing himself the accuser and the master's trusted man, so that the fall, when it came, would come from the greatest possible height, in front of the greatest possible number, and leave no room anywhere for the sorrowful excuses at which the steward was so practiced. Rowan had asked for it to be done properly. He meant to see that it was. He learned it in the great stone hall, where he had come expecting only a swift and simple dismissal for the master's steward to set his seal upon, and found instead the whole of the household gathered and waiting, and Mrs. Brow. Dunmore standing stiff and pale with a confusion she could not hide, and old Miss Eloan Marsh herself brought all the way down from her tower to sit wrapped in her shawls in a great chair drawn close beside the fire, and at the head of the long hall, dressed now in the dark and perfect and unmistakable clothes of his true rank, stood the master of Ellenmere himself, whom Halvan Pryke in all his months of service had never once seen close enough to know, and whose face, as it turned slowly now toward him down the length of the hall, the steward began, with a dawning and dreadful horror. "To recognize Mr. Pryke," said Cassian Dray, in the cold and level voice that the whole county feared. "You have come before me to accuse a member of my household of theft. I confess I find that a matter of very great interest, because I have spent this last week in several candles with it, among the northern accounts that you were so very reluctant to lay before my eyes." He raised a single sheet of paper into the light. "Shall we discuss together the fee that was paid, in full and on the quarter day, to the surveyor Verrill, in the autumn of the year that my grandfather had the high moor mapped? The very fee that your own careful hand here recorded as sent and settled, and which the surveyor's daughter will swear upon any book you like was never once received by her father. Shall we discuss, Mr. Pryke, precisely where a sum of that size goes, when it leaves my accounts by one door and reaches no honest man by any other?" The color ran out of the steward's face the way water runs out of a cracked and tilted jug. And Rowan Verrill stepped forward out from among the ranks of the servants where she had stood so long as furniture and furniture no longer, and she reached up and pushed back the plain linen laundress's cap from her hair, and she lifted her chin, and she spoke in a clear and steady voice that carried without effort into every far corner of that great stone hall. "You told me once, Mr. Pryke, that grief made me imagine things," she said. "You told me that I had no one left in all the world to protect me. You were right about the second thing, sir. For 2 long years you were entirely right about it." Her eyes did not once leave his face. "You are not right any longer." It did not take very long after that. Guilt seldom does. Once the daylight has finally reached it, the ledgers were read aloud before them all. The forged signatures that Rowan had carried, folded against her heart across 3 parishes and through a storm, were laid down side by side upon the table, with the steward's own recording hand, and the 2 were seen to match as only a forger's true hand can ever be made to match its own forgery. Halvan Pryke, who had never once in the whole of his life been made to raise his voice, discovered now that he had no voice left to raise. He was led away at the last to answer before the magistrate in the town, the very same law that he had once so gently threatened her with, turned round now in the end to face him instead, and the last that Rowan Verrill ever saw of the man who had unmade her was his sorrowful and stooping back, going out through the great door of the hall into an ordinary gray morning, brought down and ruined by nothing grander in the end than the truth itself, patiently kept and plainly told. The Marquis did not gloat over it. He watched the man go with no trace of triumph anywhere in his face, only a kind of weary and settled justice, and Rowan understood, watching him watch, that this too was a thing his grandmother had spent her life trying to teach him, that the true measure of power is never how hard a man can bring it down, but how carefully he chooses to. As for the housekeeper, Mrs. Dunmore, who had believed the steward's word against the girl and made Rowan's life the harder for it, Cassian did not dismiss her. She had been hard and proud and quick to think ill of a servant beneath her, but she had not been dishonest, and he had learned enough in 1 week of a borrowed coat to know the difference now. He required only that she hear the whole of the truth spoken aloud before the assembled house and watch the woman she had scorned stand vindicated, and that was a punishment more exact than any dismissal. To her credit, the housekeeper took it standing, and when it was over she crossed the hall to Rowan and said stiffly that she had misjudged her, and that she was sorry for it. It was not warmly said, but it was said which Rowan had not expected, and she inclined her head and accepted it, for she had never wanted anyone's ruin, not even those who had wanted hers. It was full summer over the moor before Rowan Verrill had her own name restored to her in law, and her father's honor set right again upon paper for any man to read, and her stone cottage and her good bottomland by the water returned into her hands with every last stolen coin repaid in full. Not as a gift given, for Cassian had understood at last that she would never in her life accept a gift of it. As a debt of the house of Elenmere, owed and acknowledged and discharged entire, in the full and open light of day, exactly as she had asked that it should be, she did not leave. She could have gone anywhere she pleased, for she was a woman of her own means once more, mistress again of her own small acres, beholden now to no living soul on earth, and that Cassian had insisted upon from the very first was the whole entire point of it. That, whatever might come to pass between them afterward, she must first of all be wholly free to turn and walk away, so that if, in the end, she chose to stay, she would be staying for no reason, and no person under heaven but her own free and unpurchased choosing. It was, old Miss Marsh observed dryly from her tower window, quite the single most sensible thing the boy had managed to do in the whole course of his life, and so Rowan stayed. At the first, she stayed only to set the great and long-neglected library to rights, for she had a clerk's clear hand and a reader's patient mind, and Elenmere's thousands of books had wanted an honest keeper for a generation and more, and the master of Elenmere, who had lived the whole of his life until now held tight in a held breath, began, slowly and day by day, to let that breath go. The many chimneys of the great house smoked now, every one of them, against the summer sky. The little cold court behind the pump put out, against one gray wall, a stubborn climbing rose that neither of them would ever quite admit to having planted there. And in the long light evenings, more and more often, a plain-spoken young woman and a wary and unbending man might be seen walking together upon the high moor that her father had once walked and mapped, saying very little, for they found they had little need of words, two people who had each of them been given, freely, and for nothing, wed. And in the last place, either had thought to look, the one thing that each had long ago stopped believing the world still held. He asked her in the end, upon just such a walk, with the whole green county falling gently away below them into the blue evening, and no witness in all the world but a half-blind old woman watching from a high tower window, and pretending very hard that she was not. He did not ask her as a marquess. He had learned, at the last, that much. He asked her as the plain man in the borrowed brown coat, who had once stood at a country lich gate in the morning mist, and watched a girl give up her one free morning of the week to the grave of a stranger who could never know it, or repay it, and had thought before ever he knew her name. That is a real thing, in a world I had thought was made all of counterfeit. I had very nearly forgotten there were real things left in it. I have nothing to offer you that you have any need of, he said to her. You have your own name back now, and your own land, and your own freedom, dependent upon no one, which means only this, that if you should say yes to me, then I will know. For the first and the only time in the whole of my life, I will know beyond the smallest shadow of a doubt that it was given freely, and for nothing, and that Rowan is the one single thing that all my money could never once buy for me. So I am asking you, not the Marquis of Elenmere, only me. And Rowan Verl, who had knelt in the cold mist to scrub clean the nameless grave of a stranger because she could not bear that even a stranger should stay forgotten, looked long at the man who had so very nearly forgotten his own living heart until she had gone and reminded him of it without ever meaning to, and she gave him her answer, freely, and for nothing. And it was the richest thing that either of the two of them would ever come to own. High up in the east tower, old Lowen Marsh, who saw everything worth seeing and almost nothing else, let the curtain fall softly back across the glass, and smiled to herself in the firelight, and said aloud into the empty room, and to the dear old friend who was no longer in it to hear her, "There now, Sabra. You were right, my dear, in the end, as you so nearly always were. He had a heart in him the whole while. He needed only for someone to come along and ask him for help, and never once guessed that he was the one being rescued.